They buried 15 children before they ever took their first breath. 15 times Grace felt hope flutter beneath her heart. 15 times she whispered names into the darkness. 15 times that hope dissolved into grief so deep it had no words. The doctors called it unexplained recurrent loss. Her mother-in-law called it God's will. But Grace knew only one truth. Her body had become a graveyard for children who never got to live. This is her story, a story of loss so profound it could have destroyed her. Instead, it led somewhere no one, not even Grace herself, could have imagined. Before we continue, my friends say this channel will fail. Please subscribe to help me prove them wrong. Grace married Daniel when she was 24 in a small church ceremony filled with flowers and promises. It was a good marriage. They'd met through mutual friends, fallen in love over coffee and conversations about the future. He made her laugh. She made him think. They fit together like puzzle pieces that had been searching for each other. "How many children do you want?" he asked on their honeymoon. "3," she said, smiling. "Maybe 4 if we're brave enough." "I want a house full of noise," he'd said, pulling her close. "Kids running everywhere, laughter in every room." They started trying immediately, young, hopeful, certain that parenthood was just around the corner. 6 months later, Grace held a positive pregnancy test in shaking hands. The joy was overwhelming. They called their parents, told close friends, started planning a nursery. Daniel painted the spare room yellow, gender neutral, he said, because it didn't matter if they had a boy or a girl. They just wanted their baby. At 9 weeks, Grace woke up bleeding. By the afternoon, the pregnancy was gone. "It happens more often than people realize," the doctor assured them. 1 in 4 pregnancies end in early loss. It's tragic, but it's common. There's no reason you can't try again. So they did. 2 months later, Grace was pregnant again. This time they were cautious, told only their parents. Grace cut back her hours at work, avoided stress, prayed every morning and night. At 11 weeks, she thought they were safe. At 12 weeks, her body betrayed her again. The 3rd pregnancy ended at 6 weeks, the 4th at 10. The 5th never showed a heartbeat on the ultrasound. The doctor called it a blighted ovum, as if medical terminology could soften the blow. By the 7th loss, Grace had stopped decorating nurseries. By the 10th, she'd stopped telling people she was pregnant. By the 13th, she'd stopped believing it would ever work. Each loss carved something out of her, not just hope, but pieces of herself. Her laughter became quieter. Her smile became practiced. She learned to carry grief like a second shadow, always present, always dark. After the 8th loss, Daniel stopped taking days off work when it happened. At first, he'd held her, cried with her, made doctor's appointments and researched treatments, and promised they'd figure it out together. But loss after loss, his presence faded. Not all at once, slowly, like sand slipping through fingers. "I'm sorry," he'd say when she told him the bleeding started again, and then he'd go to work, come home late, sit in silence through dinner. The space between them grew wider with each pregnancy that failed. They stopped talking about the future, stopped making plans, stopped looking at each other the way they used to, with hope and possibility. By the 14th loss, they were strangers sharing a home. Grace worked at a bookstore, shelving books and helping customers, pretending her life wasn't falling apart. She came home to empty rooms and a husband who barely looked up from his laptop when she walked in. "How was your day?" she'd ask. "Fine," he'd say. Nothing more. They ate in silence, slept on opposite sides of the bed, lived parallel lives that never quite touched anymore. It was Daniel's mother who finally intervened. She invited them to Sunday dinner, a command, not a request. The whole family gathered, Daniel's siblings with their children, aunts and uncles, cousins. The house was loud with the chaos Grace had once imagined for her own home. After the meal, Daniel's mother pulled Grace aside. "I need to speak with you," she said, her voice gentle but firm. They sat in the garden, away from the noise. For a moment, neither spoke. "You've been married 6 years," Daniel's mother began. "My son is 32 now. A family needs continuity." Grace's chest tightened. She knew where this was going. "I've tried," Grace whispered. "You know I've tried." "I know, dear, and I'm not blaming you, but sometimes we have to accept that what we want isn't meant to be. Sometimes we have to step aside so others can have what we can't." The words landed like stones. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying my son deserves to be a father. If you can't give him that—" She paused, her meaning clear without being cruel. "Then perhaps you love him enough to let him find someone who can." Grace felt something crack inside her chest. "You want me to leave him?" He looked at her for a long, terrible moment. And instead of denying it immediately, instead of reassuring her, he said, "I don't know anymore." Those 4 words destroyed what 15 losses hadn't managed to break. 3 weeks later, Daniel moved out. He didn't call it separation, didn't use the word divorce. He just said he needed space to think and rented a small apartment across town. Grace was left alone in the house they'd bought together, the house with the yellow nursery they'd never filled, the house that echoed with the absence of children who never came and a husband who couldn't stay. She stopped going to church, couldn't bear another sermon about blessings and God's perfect timing, stopped attending family gatherings where everyone had children except her, stopped answering calls from friends who didn't know what to say to her anymore. She went to work, came home, sat in the dark, repeated, day after day, week after week. One night, staring at her reflection in the bathroom mirror, she spoke out loud to the empty house. "I accept it. I will never be a mother." Saying it out loud made it real, made it final. And beneath the crushing weight of that acceptance, she felt something unexpected, the tiniest sliver of peace. If she would never be a mother, she could stop trying, stop hoping, stop breaking her own heart over and over. She could just exist. It was the saddest kind of peace, but it was something. 6 months passed. Daniel filed for divorce. Grace signed the papers without fighting. What was there to fight for? He wanted children, she couldn't give them to him. The math was simple and devastating. She threw herself into work, picking up extra shifts at the bookstore. It was there, surrounded by stories of other people's lives, that she found a kind of solitude that didn't hurt quite so much. One rainy afternoon, a little girl wandered into the store. She was maybe 5 years old, wearing a too-big raincoat and carrying a stuffed rabbit that'd seen better days. She walked straight to the children's section and sat down on the floor, opening a picture book. Grace watched her for a few minutes, waiting for a parent to appear. When no one came, she approached gently. "Hi there, are you here with someone?" The little girl looked up with serious brown eyes. "My grandma, she's at the doctor next door. She said I could wait here." "Does she know where you are?" The girl nodded, returning to her book. Grace sat down beside her. "What are you reading?" "A story about a bunny who gets lost." "Does he find his way home?" "Not yet. I'm only on page 5. Something about the girl's matter-of-fact tone made Grace smile, her first real smile in months. "I'm Grace. What's your name?" "Lily." "That's a beautiful name." They sat together, reading. When the book ended, the bunny did find his way home. Lily picked up another, then another. An hour passed before an elderly woman appeared, apologizing profusely. "I'm so sorry. The doctor was running late and I lost track of time." "It's okay," Grace said. Lily was wonderful company. As they left, Lily turned back. "Will you be here next week?" "I work most afternoons." "Okay, I'll come read with you again." And she did. Week after week, Lily came to the bookstore while her grandmother attended medical appointments. She and Grace developed a routine, reading together, talking about stories, sharing quiet companionship. Grace learned that Lily's parents had died in a car accident 2 years ago, that she lived with her grandmother who was sick with something the doctors couldn't quite fix, that Lily was lonely and scared and trying to be brave. Grace saw herself in this little girl, both of them carrying losses too big for their bodies. One afternoon, Lily's grandmother approached Grace privately. "I don't have much time left," she said quietly. "Months, maybe. The social worker is already talking about foster care for Lily after I'm gone." She paused, her eyes hopeful and desperate. "You've been kinder to her than anyone in a long time." Grace felt something shift in her chest, like a door opening that she thought was permanently sealed. "What are you asking?" "I'm asking if you'd consider, if you might be willing." The grandmother took a breath. "Would you take her when I'm gone? Would you give her a home?" Grace didn't answer immediately. She went home that night and sat in the yellow nursery she'd never had the courage to repaint. For 6 years, she'd tried to bring a child into this room. 15 times she'd failed. But maybe she'd been looking for children in the wrong place. She called the social worker the next morning. The process was complicated. Background checks, home visits, classes on fostering and trauma-informed care. Grace threw herself into it with an intensity she hadn't felt in years. 8 months later, 8 months during which Lily's grandmother passed away peacefully, 8 months during which Grace and Lily spent every possible moment together, Grace stood in a courthouse.
The judge signed the papers, made it official. "Congratulations, Miss Harris. Lily is now legally your daughter." Grace looked down at the little girl holding her hand, this child who had wandered into her bookstore on a rainy day and wandered straight into her heart. "Hi, Mama," Lily whispered. Grace's eyes filled with tears, happy tears this time, always happy tears now. "Hi, sweetheart. Let's go home." Daniel heard about the adoption through mutual friends. He showed up at Grace's door on a Saturday afternoon, looking uncomfortable and uncertain. "I heard you adopted a child." "I did. Can I meet her?" Grace considered saying no, considered slamming the door, considered all the ways he'd hurt her. But she saw something in his face she hadn't seen in years: regret. "She's in the backyard reading. I'll get her." When Lily came inside, Daniel knelt to her level. "Hi, Lily. I'm an old friend of your mom's." "Nice to meet you," Lily said politely, before returning to her book. After she left, Daniel stood awkwardly in the living room he used to share with Grace. "I made a mistake," he said quietly. "I gave up. I left when you needed me most. I thought I needed biological children to be happy, but I was wrong. I just needed to be brave enough to try something different." Grace looked at the man she'd once loved enough to marry, the man who'd left her alone in her darkest moment. "I forgive you," she said, "but that doesn't mean I forget. You made your choice, Daniel, and I've made mine." "I understand." He turned to leave, then paused. "For what it's worth, you're gonna be an amazing mother." "I already am," Grace said softly. After he left, Grace sat in the yellow nursery, now decorated with Lily's drawings and books and stuffed animals, and felt something she hadn't felt in years: complete. Not because a man validated her, not because her body finally cooperated, but because she'd found her daughter in the most unexpected way. Motherhood had come to her not through biology, but through a rainy day, a children's book, and a little girl who needed love as much as Grace needed to give it. 2 years later, Grace stood in Lily's elementary school for the Mother's Day program. All around her were mothers: biological mothers, adoptive mothers, stepmothers, grandmothers, women who became mothers in 1,000 different ways. Lily stood on stage with her class, and when it was her turn to speak, she said, "My mama is special because she chose me. She didn't have to love me, but she does. She says we chose each other." Grace's eyes filled with tears, happy tears this time, always happy tears now. After the program, another mother approached her. "I heard about your journey, the losses you went through. I just want to say, you're an inspiration." Grace smiled. "I'm not special. I just kept going when I wanted to give up, and I learned that sometimes the thing you're looking for is looking for you, too. You just have to be open enough to see it." That night, tucking Lily into bed, Grace thought about the past decade, the 15 losses, the divorce, the loneliness, the grief.
And she thought about this little girl who called her mama, who drew her pictures, who ran to her when she was scared, who filled the yellow nursery with laughter and life. She wouldn't change anything, not if it meant she wouldn't have this. "Mama?" Lily's sleepy voice pulled her from her thoughts. "Yes, baby? I'm glad you're my mama. I'm glad you're my daughter, even though I didn't come from your tummy?" Grace kissed her forehead. "Especially because you didn't come from my tummy. You came from something better. You came from fate, from God, from a rainy day when a little girl walked into a bookstore and changed everything. Tell me that story again." So Grace did. She told Lily about the rainy day, the picture book about the lost bunny, and how sometimes the best things in life arrive when you've stopped looking for them. Lily fell asleep with a smile on her face, and Grace sat in that yellow nursery, finally full, finally right, and whispered into the darkness, "Thank you for all of it, the losses and the loneliness and the heartbreak, because it all led me here. It all led me to her." Some wounds take years to heal. Some miracles arrive only after the world has stopped watching. The path to motherhood isn't always the one we plan. Sometimes it's written in loss and loneliness and heartbreak. Sometimes it leads through darkness so deep we think we'll never find light again. But sometimes, just sometimes, on the other side of that darkness, there's a child who needs you just as much as you need them. And that's when you realize you weren't broken.
You were just being prepared for a different kind of blessing. A blessing named Lily, or whatever name love decides to give it.